Hello, and welcome to the Argyle CISO Leadership Forum, Cloud Security and Governance. My name is Nick with Argyle, and it's great to have everyone joining us today. I have some important information to share with you, and then we'll turn the floor over to our esteemed opening keynote speaker. First, we would like to take a moment to thank today's sponsors, Hawks Hunt and Forge Rock. Our sponsors are committed to providing you with valuable content and a great overall experience. We also welcome you to stay socially connected during today's event. For those of you who are active on social media, please use the hashtag ArgyleDigital and follow us at Argyle Exec Forum. Also, be sure to follow Argyle on LinkedIn for special announcements. I would like to take a moment to touch on our content neutrality policy, which we have curated based on the feedback we have received over the years from our members. We have worked closely with our speaking faculty to ensure that you receive a set of balanced and neutral viewpoints during the session today, and we appreciate our members' support of this policy. Finally, and most importantly, we want to hear from you. So during each session, we encourage you to submit your questions and comments in the Q&A box on your screen. Following each presentation, we have set aside time for our speakers to weigh in on your questions. Thank you again for joining us today. Now, let's get started. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Lalit Panda, Managing Director, Supply Chain Technology, Altria. We are excited to have Lalit with us for his opening keynote presentation titled Global Supply Chain, Building Consistency, Security, and Auditability into Digital Transformation. Welcome, Lalit. Over to you.
Thank you, Nicholas. Good morning, everybody. I'm happy to be here today to speak about supply chain and cybersecurity in the supply chain and how to address this important issue. You know, supply chains were at the back office topic for a long time until recently, and now it is on everybody's mouth because there's been a lot of disruption in recent times. And because of the nature of the supply chain and the criticality of it, this is now a very attacked sector in terms of cybersecurity. In fact, there was a report from Mandiant which said that it is the second most prevalent infection vector in 2021, and it has increased dramatically from 2020 to 2021 in terms of the number of incidents that we are seeing. There's a report from Gartner also that says manufacturing specifically is one of the most targeted sectors in terms of ransomware and cybersecurity attacks. And specifically, if you look at the report from the World Economic Forum on trends in cybersecurity, SMBs are of particular concern. 88% of small and medium-sized businesses are of concern in terms of their cybersecurity stance. And this is one of the fundamental changes in terms of cybersecurity within organizations, is that for a long time, the focus was on hardening the organization and its internal areas. You know, many years ago, I had hired Deloitte to do a security survey of our organization worldwide. And they came back and told me that your stance with regard to cybersecurity is like a tortoise. You're hard on the shell and you're soft in the interior because you've got all the intrusion protection and all the hardening on the outside exterior surface, but you haven't taken care of your internal vulnerabilities. Now that has expanded beyond the organization and into the whole ecosystem of partners. So if you're looking at supply chain specifically, there are two aspects to it. One aspect being the physical supply chain, which is moving products from source to the end consumer. And there are many vulnerable points in this physical supply chain, and that raises disruption risk considerably. There is also, you know, if you look at all the participants in the supply chain, the ecosystem, you don't only have the products and parts vendors, but you also have the service providers, the managed service providers, the security service providers, the digital service providers, you know, the SaaS providers, et cetera, and customers and distributors and many other participants, including transportation, et cetera. So there are lots of vulnerable points which can become access points for bad actors. And the weakest link in the chain is always the most vulnerable point. So the need of the hour is to expand beyond the organization to look at this whole ecosystem and look at where the potential risks are. And in addition to this physical supply chain, there's also a data supply chain. And that data supply chain relates to the software products. Physical products also have, the software on the devices itself. The motherboard has software. So you have these three aspects: the edge, the host, and the network. And all of those, in terms of the software development practices and the quality and the security of the software itself, are also another aspect of that supply chain that is important to consider when you're trying to secure it. The impact of supply chain disruptions, as we have seen over the last couple of years, can be dramatic and catastrophic to organizations. And in many cases, the loss of market share, if there is product shortages, can be possibly permanent, and it can lead to EBITDA and EPS impact, which is very difficult from an organization's point of view. So there's a huge business disruption risk here that can cause a lot of problems. In addition to the financial and market impacts, there is also the overhead to address a disruption. I'll give you an example. We used to have a software to log labor hours in the factory in one of my organizations. And that company was a SaaS provider of that software. And they had a ransomware attack, and their site was down for months. And we had to scramble to organize a different way, a manual way of capturing labor hours so we could pay our people. And that kind of focus on resolving a problem takes energy away from other strategic initiatives that the organization has to address. So that overhead is also one of the downsides of this disruption. And then, of course, there is always the loss of IP if there is intrusion into your systems, and loss of data and loss of critical company information. So all of these aspects are involved in the supply chain. But before we go into the details, let's address what exactly is the supply chain, and what are the processes that happen within the supply chain, and how does it go outside the four walls into that ecosystem that we have been talking about. So the first step in a supply chain is developing a product. And there are a lot of partners in the ecosystem in developing a product. They could be software providers, they could be designers of equipment and components and parts. So they're all involved in that communication and chain of information sharing and data sharing between the groups in developing a product. The next part is the planning part. How do we get the product to market? How much should we get, when, and all that? And for that also, there is a lot of collaboration between contract manufacturers, between data providers that host the planning engines, etc. The third piece is the sourcing piece, where you're going out and sourcing the materials to make the products that you have planned. And that involves a host of sub-suppliers, various tiers and all. And so sourcing is a third step in that process. The fourth is a manufacturing step, where you're making the product, and that involves not just the internal operations technology, but also the equipment providers that you use to manufacture the product. So making and manufacturing the product is the fourth step. And the final step in the process is delivery. And that's where the customer interaction, the transportation, et cetera, happens. So these are the 5 stages, and there are participants in the ecosystem in each of those 5 stages. And so to make sure that you're securing the supply chain, you have to go outside the 4 walls and address each of these different segments of the supply chain. So what makes supply chains so complex? The globalization in the past decades has created a very complex, long supply chains for a lot of products. And these are multi-node, meaning that there are countries where you're producing and also distributing into. So it's becoming as very complex because of the extent of number of nodes in the countries that you manufacture and source from and distribute to. The second is it is becoming multi-tiered and multi-echelon. What I mean by that is that you've got tiers of suppliers, but you also have layers of suppliers, and these are of different levels of expertise within them regarding, their cybersecurity stance. So you've got a complex situation where you have to track a lot of suppliers. And, if you take an electronic product, for instance, an audio video receiver, it's got 8,000 components, and that come from a variety of different participants in the multi-echelon supply chain. The third and fourth elements are the what we call now VUCA, which is variability, unpredictability, complexity, and ambiguity. This is what's driving some of the complexity in the supply chain, because things are changing so fast. And you saw that in the COVID crisis also, demand shooting much beyond what was anticipated, leading to semiconductor shortages and enormous amount of communications with the vendors there. So the other problem with supply chain and why it is complex is, as you make the complex supply chain longer and global, the visibility across the supply chain becomes a problem. And so, there's also this breadth of products and suppliers and parts, as products become more complex with a lot more advanced electronic features. If you look at automotives, for instance, 20 years back, they had very little electronics in them, and now they are basically computers on wheels. So it becomes very difficult when you have so many different parts and products coming together. So the unimpeded flow of data is key to sustaining operations. That's why it's important to make the supply chain as risk-free as possible. And just to emphasize that criticality in the of data in the supply chain, the end-to-end visibility is a key to success that we talked about. And there are millions of new entry points for bad actors. You have the nodes that we talked about and tiers, and the number of communications that happen while an organization is developing and producing a product, that it becomes very easy for bad actors to have more surface area to attack. And data in store and motion are extensive now because of the number of participants. Now the number of transactions are high, but the complexity of information of data elements that are there in each of the transactions and the number of participants becomes, again, significant amount of data that is moving across partners. In fact, one of the studies from the World Economic Forum says that every individual is generating 1.7 MB of data in every second across the world. So that's the amount of data and significant part of that is in the supply chain. Now, we talked about IP and market intelligence. We see geopolitical tensions and, country actors, also country-sponsored actors trying to get after market intelligence and IP. So that's, again, another reason why data is so critical. Now, the operations technology, the technology that runs manufacturing operations, the software that runs equipment in the manufacturing shop floor, they are also becoming increasingly vulnerable. And that's one of the reasons why manufacturing has become a soft target for a lot of these actors. And then to add to that complexity, there is a lot of Internet of Things edge devices, and they are adding vulnerabilities to the scenario. I'll just stop here and answer one of the questions that came up in the chat. The smart automation in the SMBs, one of the things about technology is, the question is, what would be your advice to small and medium businesses that have not implemented smart automation in their supply chain process? Now, smart automation is something that we'll probably have to consider, whether you are a large or a small business, because of the productivity benefits of that. The thing to do is to make sure that the supplier of the smart automation platforms have the same level of rigor and controls that you would exercise for your internal organization, and to make sure that you are buying the right sort of resources that can help implement the productivity benefits without adding risk to your scenario. So we will address some of that in subsequent slides. So how do we address the security issue in the supply chain? The key considerations: where is the data stored? Having an inventory of the assets and the data where they reside is the first step. The second step is what levels of access controls are in place. Now, access controls internally within the organization have always been a focus with the identity and access management solutions, but to make sure that the whole ecosystem has the same level of controls as you have for your organization. I think that's critical. And the man-in-the-middle attacks are also becoming very common. So how do you ensure that the participants in the ecosystem have the same level of protection for data in motion as you? And then there is also this aspect of measuring the maturity of data security awareness. There was a study recently done by ENISA, which is the European National Information Security Agency, and their conclusion was that 66% of suppliers were either not aware or were not transparent about an attack that they had experienced versus 9% of customers. What does that mean? It means that the suppliers do not have the level of maturity that the customers have in terms of addressing. So with large organizations, they have the focus and attention, but not the smaller business partners and the suppliers. There is also the awareness among employees, and that obviously has been a focus of a lot of security organizations, making sure that you have the right tools for employee awareness and testing, and then the communication vendors. So assessing what is the level of maturity across this set of participants is important. Now, a lot of organizations have huge number of applications in their landscape. And the age of the applications, the components that they use, I think that's very key to make sure that the interfaces that are there, how secure are those, and making sure that you're making an assessment of that is also very important. And then, there are secure software development framework from the NIST and the Open Web Application Security Project has the top 10, in terms of software development practices to make secure software. And that's very key also to make sure that, organizations are adopting those standards and making sure that they are following those frameworks in terms of their software development. There are 5 good practices that ENISA, which is the European National Information Security Agency that I was talking about, have talked about. Let's just quickly review those. The first is to have a strategic corporate approach towards, this is not a technology issue as much as it's a business risk management issue. So funding this efforts within the organization, having a structured organization to address that, not just from the main internal cybersecurity framework, but also within the business, having regular processes of review, putting policies in practice. I think all of these is very important in terms of having a strong corporate approach towards cybersecurity in the supply chain. The second part is understanding your supply chain. Where are the risks? Who are the suppliers? And what are the dependencies that you have with some of these suppliers? Making an assessment of that and assessing that risk landscape is also a very key aspect. The third aspect is managing those suppliers, in terms of defining contractual requirements, holding them accountable, monitoring them, managing their performance. That's, again, another key aspect of it. And then how do you handle vulnerabilities? Managing your vulnerabilities in terms of knowing your assets, monitoring and patching. And that's, again, in the same context, not only internally within your organization, but also making sure that not just your organization, but your ecosystem have defined maintenance policies that they are focusing on reducing and eliminating vulnerabilities as soon as they happen. And then making sure, as we said, the quality of products and practices, whether they're physical or software product, making sure that they have the right process and infrastructure in terms of developing them, you're measuring the quality, and having transparency in that process. So, these 5 practices are essential in terms of getting to that. So I will move quickly since we have only 5 minutes until the Q&A. But, the SDLC practices, the software development life cycle that we mentioned, preparing the organization, making sure that you have the right software, and just looking at the software BOM, the bill of materials with regard to software, the components that go into building your product, making sure those are secure. That's one of the key things in ensuring that you have secure software. And then responding to it with the readiness, response, resolve, and remediate framework whenever you have a situation like that. There are some standard practices. Let's just quickly review that, and then we can talk further in the Q&A. Having a stratification of your suppliers, having a qualified vendor list, making sure that you are focusing on the ones that pose the maximum risk initially and then expanding from there. That's one of the practices. So, focusing on the broader vendor list and the multi-echelon supply chain that we talked about earlier. Having comprehensive SRQs, supplier risk questionnaires, and ensuring that you have security compliance standards that you can, communicate policies that you want your suppliers to be adhering to. Having that structured approach to that is very key. You have to have vendor audits. That's an essential aspect of making sure and managing the suppliers and holding them accountable to ensuring that they are following their due process with regard to their security, and making sure that you have those in your contractual agreements as well, the right to audit, and making sure that you have the ability to access their systems and make sure that they have the right processes in place. In terms of the organization, having supply chain focused business information security officers is critical. NSA reports that only about 24% of organizations that were surveyed have dedicated roles for supply chain. And because the supply chain is becoming as complex as it is, having somebody who understands the context of the supply chain and can assess and respond to those risks and ensure that the process goes on is a very key aspect of that. There's a lot of privileged accounts and password remediation that has to be done on a regular basis. It's something that is the grunt work of ensuring security in applications, especially in the operations technology arena. So I think making sure that you have those processes in place is extremely critical. Having a really good landscape of the software and applications that are running using tools like Nozomi, making sure that you have version management and patching. General expectation is that, in terms of ICT, it's less than 1 month, but with OT, it's a little longer because OT has the other risk that if you update patches on a more regular basis, it can bring down your manufacturing because these systems that are in OT are really driving your manufacturing in your machines. So you have to test and validate all of them before you implement those patches. So it takes a little longer for the OT. Phishing simulation and gamification is a standard practice that everybody uses now, making sure that you do that across the supply chain, making sure that your suppliers' emails are secure when they come in and don't have phishing. All that is critical. And desktop exercises, responding and simulating situations where you have to address a significant risk that's coming up. That's an important part of preparation. And then, standard log auditing tools like Splunk or Manage Engine, making sure that you're aggregating the logs from various systems to be able to do forensic analysis and or review those logs to make sure that there is no, complications or violations of your integrity. That's also important. So what are the conclusions? I'll just take a few seconds here to quickly skim through the conclusions before we talk about questions. This is, again, something to emphasize is that cybersecurity in the supply chain is becoming very critical, and organizations are running significant risks if they are not paying enough attention to making sure that the security across the supply chain, across the ecosystem is managed. The 4 areas to focus on in the supply chain is, the data, people, infrastructure, and applications, and making sure that you have defined policies, procedures, and plans in place for all of those 4. Having a consistent security stance, not just internally within the organization, but also for external partners in the supply chain, both in the physical and the data domains, is essential. And it's important to have a multifunctional team and, business participation, because there are things that, the ICT organization may not be aware of, but, a business team that is focused on interacting with the supply chain partners on a regular basis is going to be able to provide that insight. So map the entire chain, stratify, and make sure that you have the right focus at the right levels. Continuously assess and respond to those risks. Develop standards and ensure compliance that we mentioned. And then a formal process that we talked about earlier also, to evaluate, map, evaluate, remediate, and just monitor them on a regular basis, making sure that they are keeping pace with the developments in technologies and the threat landscape that is happening. And finally, adequate funding and messaging is important to proactively manage risks. So this was my presentation. Let's go to questions. Nicholas, if you can go ahead and announce some of the questions, we can respond to them.
Sure, Lalit. Okay, here's a question from the audience. Embedding security throughout the supply chain is a great concept, but how can we be sure our vendors are doing the same?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that is where we need to have that much higher level of integration and cooperation between the vendors. And this is that aspect of supply chain, supplier risk management that I mentioned earlier. One of the 5 principles is, how do you ensure that you are close to your suppliers and you know who the key risk, what are the key risk points, which are the main suppliers that you need to focus on, having auditability within those supplier systems, making sure that you're having those conversations with the suppliers on a regular basis, really actively managing. Earlier when we talked about supplier management, we were talking only about transactions. Now it is beyond transactions. It is also making sure that their systems and procedures are, geared to be able to address threats, and that they don't pose a threat to you in terms of the transactions they share with you.
Great. Here's another audience question. Do you have any recommendations for open source tools to be used as an organization's security tool?
Well, there are so many tools that are out there. I would suggest looking at those log monitoring tools I mentioned, having Log 360, for instance, from ManageEngine, etc. I'm not going to specify a lot of these individual tools that would not be right here, but I can say that there are significant number of tools you can make an assessment. There are organizations like Gartner that can give you some guidance about, which are the most appropriate tools for your context. But there is a plethora of choices out there, and you can use them to identify the right one for you.
Great. And I think we have time for one more question. What can we do today to improve our feedback and benchmarking of supply chain partners?
So I think the key here is, having that conversation with the supply chain partners to share, your stance towards cybersecurity, the criticality of cybersecurity for your operations, and making sure that they are on the same page, and having those quality metrics, with regard to those 5 broad areas that I had mentioned earlier, having the quality metrics to measure that, and having quarterly, sort of reviews with your supply chain partners, making sure that they are showing improved trends in each of those metrics, knowing your assets, where is your data, what are the systems that you have in your landscape. I think that's very important, because a lot of organizations have complexity in the enterprise framework of applications, and it is very difficult to address a problem if you're not aware of where that problem is. So I think making that assessment is also very critical. So I think it is really having an organized process around managing security in the supply chain.
Excellent. And thank you again, Lalit, for an excellent keynote. I also want to thank everyone else for joining us today. This session, along with all of today's content, will be available on demand following the event.